Going back and playing parts of a developer's earlier work can be a lot of fun. It's equally likely to be something you can look at and say, ah yes, I see how they got to where they are now, as it is to be a shocked, they made what? Type reaction. When I first heard about Lost Kingdoms, it was definitely the latter. This game is a deck-building action RPG created by From Software, the people who brought you Kingsfield, Armored Core, and eventually, and most notably these days, the Souls games and their immediate brethren like Elden Ring. The game essentially has two distinct modes you'll spend most of your time in. Much like old-school JRPGs, exploring the world is delineated from the random encounter-centric combat. In exploration, you are basically just walking around, talking to NPCs, picking up items, and solving puzzles. Now, most of the items you're going to pick up are cards out of chests or keys to unlock new areas, and most of the puzzles are barely deserving of the name, but they are things to do. In combat, however, you are given whatever actions that your cards allow. Many of the battles you enter are random, as you walk around the game's levels, but you're still in the actual game world, just cut down to a smaller battle arena. This also leads to a weird dynamic where there will be barrels or something around a chest that you can only break when in combat mode. So you just run around a lot next to the barrels until you get a random battle to spawn so that you can break them in the ensuing combat scenario. When it comes to the cards themselves, in a lot of ways they work the way you'd expect. They correspond with monsters you'll encounter in the world, but how they manifest when they're summoned differs greatly. Most simply, they can just be a basic attack, where the monster will help you to swing a sword or thrust a spear at your enemies. But they can also manifest as a summoned monster that you transform into temporarily, that lets out a powerful attack like a dragon's fire breath. Finally, you can get summoned monsters that just stick around for a bit and fight with you. All these cards also have elemental abilities in the sort of traditional weakness-strength model, where wood is weak to fire, fire is weak to water, etc. A fact that, quite frankly, comes into play pretty rarely. Most of the time, you can just brute force your way through using cards of whatever element you want, without any real issue. You set up your deck before you go into a mission, and the real unique thing, compared to most other deck builders in the modern age, is that each time you use a card, it's exhausted, meaning that it'll get tossed until the next level, requiring you to constantly be able to think on your feet, with not only the cards you put in your deck, but also the ones you pick up in levels that can be added into your deck at specific checkpoints littered throughout. To start, the only way to recover spent cards is by rolling the dice on blue fairies in levels, which can also sometimes contain a random battle. But as you progress through the game, you'll find more cards that allow you to regenerate a large portion of your deck on demand. Finally, another way that you can get new cards in level is to catch monsters. You can turn them into new cards for yourself at any time during battle by sacrificing a card in your hand and throwing it at a monster with low health, dealing a tiny amount of damage and capturing it. There's a pretty decent variety of monsters, and therefore cards, as you make your way through the game. More than enough to ensure you're consistently replacing underpowered cards with newer, better ones, which also has the side effect of ensuring the game doesn't get stale throughout its runtime. Cards will slowly gain experience as you use them. Specifically, you need to kill monsters using a card for it to gain the maximum experience, which allows you to eventually transform them at the game's main shop, or make additional copies if you have a card that you like and use a lot. Generally, the rule in modern deck builders is to make your decks lean and mean. You don't want a lot of garbage in there, and it's best if you can increase the chance you pull the cards you really want to get. However, in Lost Kingdoms, things are a little different. The loss of cards mid-level means you don't want to have your deck so lean that you run out of your cards mid-mission. As such, my deck was always at the hard cap of 30 cards, but with what kinds of cards I was taking on each mission shuffled around. One nice thing, however, is if you do fail a mission because you've run out of cards, any cards you've collected in that level do carry over back to the main menu, meaning you can then rework your deck and take another stab at the level you just failed. Much like a lot of From Software games though, especially ones from this era specifically, there are many times when the execution doesn't live up to the promise of the concept. For starters, while you do get cards you collected before you restart a failed level, you can still be forced to go through a massive amount of gameplay to get back to some final boss you failed on, which can be incredibly frustrating, especially when the levels tend to be a little tedious on replay. On a related note, despite the different monsters and related new cards keeping the gameplay mostly interesting, the combat can still often feel monotonous and repetitive, especially within a single level as you fight the same enemies over and over again in random battles. Everything in those battles has collision, so you and your summons are always getting in each other's way, and in some particularly monster-filled battles, it can become a real nightmare for positioning very quickly, especially when it comes to monsters that you need to have facing specific directions at exact distances to effectively attack. There are plenty of summons especially that won't really work if they're too far away, or too close, or facing the wrong direction. The camera itself can also be frustrating in certain battles where it gets into a weird place where it can be difficult to figure out what's even going on. The most unfortunate thing, however, is that the game remains pretty easy for the most part, leading to a real lack of need to fully engage with the game's mechanics. The final two back-to-back bosses represent a decent bit of a difficulty spike, but it was still nowhere near enough to overcome my endgame deck. And as long as you've been constantly engaging with the deck building, replacing old cards with better ones, and learning how best to use them, you'll almost certainly breeze through. By the end of the game, I had decks built that allowed me to challenge bosses basically endlessly, by regenerating my deck just the right amount. Blundering my way through the last two bosses was a bit difficult, but blunder through I did, since I had more than enough cards to do so. But I still think that despite the fact that it doesn't succeed on every single level that it attempts to, Lost Kingdoms is still more than worth a look today. Like a lot of GameCube games, this one has gone mostly forgotten, and I think it's something that deck building fans should take a look at. Though you'll certainly need to temper your expectations a bit, especially when it comes to the monster AI. At around 7.5 hours, doing a decent amount of the side stuff that's to be found in the game, it's short enough to be a fun experience without overstaying its welcome and becoming way too grating. Both fortunately and unfortunately, this game is extremely emblematic of the From Software games that were coming out at the time. Tons of promise, great ideas that fail ever so slightly on the finish line in terms of execution, but certainly still worth having the experience if you can deal with some of the rougher edges.